Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of whether, and if so, how politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Lee Battle and I'm a minister in the United Reformed Church, where I am currently serving in an ecumenical setting in Cardiff. Each week I am joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. And today I'm so pleased to introduce to you Gary Hopkins. Gary is passionate about how the church helps people to encounter God in daily life and how spirituality breathes life into our justice-seeking and radical inclusion as part of God's mission. Gary is part of the core leadership at Inclusive Gathering Birmingham and is the Ministry Development Officer for Chaplaincy at the Methodist Church. And so, Gary, thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Pleasure.
So politics in the pulpit, Gary, I wonder what that means for you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and whether or not you see yourself as a pulpit politician?
Thank you. Great question to start with. I suppose I might be a little bit controversial here. I'm kind of on a journey where I'm seeing the pulpit as less important, which is interesting to be saying when I'm coming to talk about pulpit and the politics, but actually it's part of the journey of who I am and where I find myself in community at the moment.
Okay.
So I've been preaching for 20 years, so I've been given permission, as it were, to preach and to bring what I believe to be God's word. But I'm really conscious that in the community, so the community I'm from is a newish community. It's been around about 5 years. And we kind of shied away from the traditional form of preaching or service and have developed this model of conversation around what we're hearing God say, what the Bible might be saying in our context, what each other might be saying. And I'm finding that incredibly liberating, but also challenging to traditional notions of church. Because what I'm recognizing is that often in the pulpit, we bring our own perspective, which, you know, is right. But then do we fall into the trap of certain people occupying the pulpit and then certain power from the pulpit and certain identities? And actually in the way we're developing it in conversation, we're starting to hear voices from around the kind of community that you wouldn't necessarily have put into the pulpit, or they wouldn't necessarily have got to the point through the training or even wanted to. But I'm starting to really understand that notion of the word in our midst rather than the word from the front. So, and that's not, you know, I have to be really careful because I'm not standing here as a local preacher in the Methodist Church saying, get rid of the pulpits. But I'm actually discovering this new way of being and actually finding myself, rather than being at the front preacher, almost the pulpit is the community in the circle. And those of us perhaps that have done some kind of theological training are becoming more facilitators to enable that conversation. And I often, even yesterday, someone spoke and it wasn't, what they said was very good, but actually where I felt God speaking was in the conversation. That was the word being born in the midst of us. So part of that, and I guess the reason that for me is important politically is because it's about the voices of people in different spaces, different communities, hearing those and being challenged all the time about, actually, are the way we're doing things excluding certain people? Are we missing their real needs? Are we making assumptions about what they need and imposing our way of thinking? And actually, when you start to invite what I believe is God's kind of sense of everybody has a place within the community, that really changes what the pulpit means. So yeah, I'm starting off on a kind of radical point that actually I don't want to be up the front sharing. I want to be in conversation, discovering God. So
that's really interesting. And how do people in the community kind of respond to that? Because I know personally, when I've tried to kind of facilitate discussion, and often the room goes very silent. because there is that sense of people not feeling confident enough, or feeling that they perhaps need a theological degree to get up and preach. And I'm really interested because, like you say, we lose that dynamic of hearing other people's experiences and other people's spiritualities along the way. But equally, in my experience, lots of people just struggle with that sense of speaking in that space, because and I guess quite often it is an age and experience thing, that the older model of church, of kind of the preaching and coming from one person and no discussion about it, is very difficult for people to get their head around, that they have as much experience and as much knowledge as we do about God.
Absolutely. It's I guess I would say we've been blessed in the way our community has grown, because in some senses being a new community, so it was set up as in conversation with different people, and there was a recognition by the person that had the kind of, I guess, the inspiration, particularly to be radically inclusive around LGBTQ. So there was a lot of kind of bringing those people together. But when you start new, all those expectations aren't there. And actually, we've got a community that's very mixed. I mean, we've got people who are from Roman Catholic background, Methodism, URC, Pentecostal. We've got Greek Orthodox. So it's quite a mix, which immediately creates a multitude of expectations of what the space is, but actually also a liberation. But there are some simple things we do. What often happens is people will be chatting away before a service, and then when you start the formal service, it's almost like the conversation becomes very, this is a formal space now and I can't speak in it. And I even said that I can have a laugh and a joke, but put me in a formal situation and I kind of sometimes want to go, because I want to know what's the expectations in this space, what are the rules of this kind of all of that. But actually we do simple things where we do very small group stuff. So when we often have conversations, we'll start with pairs and give people, it's always invitational, so people never have to have a conversation. But there's simple things like we have a kind of a free flowing, if you want refreshments during whenever we're gathered, you can just get up and do it. If you want to go and sit at the back, there's no expectation of how you behave in the space. We don't start at the formal time, so we kind of allow people to carry on chatting and just kind of gently merge into kind of conversation. We ask questions often that are really simple, that anyone, that you don't need to think theologically. Well, it's interesting, you often don't need to think theologically, but it does go down the spiritual route. Simple things like, where's your favorite place to be, where are you most comfortable, and you'll be amazed at how that sparks off. So it's lots of things around how do you remove some of the barriers to people feeling, this is a formal space, I need to speak in a certain way. It's risky, because anyone can say anything in that space, and those that are very wanting to control the narrative will go, what if someone says something that we don't? Well, we throw it all in the mix, and it's never been a problem. Let's put it that way. When you step into that space and you're conscious of God's presence as you have conversation. It's cultural. It's recognizing the culture of how you do things and finding the simple things that will change and reshape that culture. And simple things like how you position people in a space makes all the difference. We've just moved into a new space which has sofas, so that immediately comfortable ease, and it does. Simple things like that make a difference. Put a cup of tea in someone's hand at the same time and a biscuit. You break the formality of this is worship, therefore I'm passive. It's a space to be community. That's some of the stuff that we kind of play around with and explore.
That's really interesting. So from your context, what would you want us to hear, Gary, as the key justice issues or political events that are rising from your community?
I think we've been on an interesting journey. One of the things that we are passionate about is where people have been excluded, we provide a place of inclusion. We have a lot of people in our community that have come out as trans, as non-binary, as lesbian or gay, who have suddenly been stopped from being able to take part, being in the pulpit for a start, from different traditions where they've just gone, actually, we've recognised your gifts for the past 10 years, but now you are being who you are called to be. That's what we would say. We don't want your contribution anymore. And so we provide a place of sanctuary. And so for some people, it is just to kind of come into terms with that and they move on. For other people, we provide that ongoing place to be. What's really interesting in our journey is we've been around 5 years talking about this narrative of inclusive faith, which for some people, they've never heard it. They've always thought, oh, Christianity is about exclusion, or certain people aren't welcome. And here we are, queer people saying God loves us and we have gifts that we are using. This year has been, over the summer, has been quite transformational. We've had 2 homes. We've never quite found a route in kind of, we've been a gathered community that I reckon have been kind of not right in the right place. But over the summer, our community leader met with some of the community leaders and businesses, and particularly people who were involved in the gay village within Birmingham and that area. And the conversation developed, and they started to say, actually, you know what, we need spirituality as part of the gay village. We haven't got that aspect. And so they started to say, oh, it would be really good if you could do more work with us. And then within a couple of weeks, one of the gay bars, which has rooms above it that they use for conference stuff and things like that, has said, you can use our space. You can come and use our space for free, and you can set that up as your home in the heart of the gay village. It really turns everything on its head, because we are no longer the host. We're no longer the people with the power. We are guests in a space being welcomed in recognition that we're bringing Jesus, to the point where one of the people who oversees the area and does the Christmas has said to us, we'd love you to bring Jesus to Christmas in the heart of the gay village. This is a completely alien experience in being in church. And for lots of people, it's like, well, we're constantly trying to push the doors open, and we're going, our doors are opening. We can have nothing else but a sense that God is saying to us, because the people there, and in Methodism, we talk about prevenient grace, where, the Holy Spirit is moving in people and going, we want you in this space. But it also, there is something about that being guest, which is very much like the Jesus model, who never hosted, was always the guest in other people's spaces and being invited to kind of be part of what's already going on. For me, there's something about the justice of and that journey of letting go of power and letting go of having to own everything. And just being alongside with the message of good news, which is being recognised in that community, So for me, that's a really exciting thing of who we've journeyed to be, kind of not really having a sense to suddenly finding this space that has now become our home. And we're already talking about what Christmas is going to look like, and we're not having to fight to get into the space. They go, no, we want you to do Christmas stuff. How can the drag queens get involved? It is a remarkable but really joyous time where that justice message of inclusion is just falling into place. So
and it's also, it's very profound that you've been invited into a space where often Christianity equals, or religion equals, pain or rejection or trauma. Religious trauma is so prevalent in the LGBTQI plus community. That's really remarkable. Now we're going to look at also the news that's going on around the world. And so we've had yet another turbulent week here in the UK, where we have now got a new Chancellor. Jeremy Hunt is now our Chancellor, and he's aiming to bring forward announcements about changes to the mini budget in order to reduce economic uncertainty. So there's a sense of U-turning again. And of course, we are still in the backdrop of the cost of living crisis, with the weather really starting to get colder. And as we start the Challenge Poverty Week, we also have, of course, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and now how drones are causing multiple explosions in Kiev. talks are still going on about Scottish independence referendum as a Supreme Court hearing goes on. We are seeing the really heartbreaking pictures and life seeing out of Somalia as they battle a really serious famine. And in our church states as well, we are still in Black History Month. This week is the week of prayer for world peace. It is Challenge Poverty Week in England and Wales, and it is Anti-Slavery Day on the 18th. And so with all this in mind, and your context, the world context, my context, is there anywhere you think is natural to start, Gary, on the lectionary readings for this week?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, there's so much for me. I mean, part of it, I think Joel talks an interesting one around. Joel for me is an interesting one because there's a lot of hope in the reading around what the future holds, or when the day of God's, the Lord's day and God's day comes, and so, but I'm conscious of that whole twee narrative of, it'll be okay in the future, that it'll be sorted out in the future. And I think there's there is an important hope to hold on in Christianity about the kingdom of God being near, and that that God will transform things. But I think there's also a challenge there that we have to do something about the reality of the situation we're in and we're called to do. So for me, there's always that balance. So I think Joel provides that hope. What I particularly like about Joel is, and I suppose the echo is the talking of the Spirit of God coming on all people, with no divisions, no kind of, the elect or the certain few. It's poured out on all, which Peter draws on at Pentecost and recognises, that's the reality of it. And I guess when I talk about being in community, I'm talking about, recognising God's Spirit in everybody and the voice of God being in everybody. And that's why I think, it's so important with Black Lives Matter, particularly that we recognise where power lies and who's involved in the power structures and who's part of the systems, and does leadership represent the reality of the community around you? Does even the church represent the community around? Because then you miss a big part of God's voice within those situations. So for me, the Black Lives Matter and all of that work that's been going on around being intentional about whose voices we're hearing, and recognizing privilege in those spaces. So I think there's a real inclusive nature to that pouring out of God's Spirit, and then the Pentecost that picks up that, I think, is key.
Yeah, I kind of, I think conversely, I struggle a little bit with the Joel reading, but kind of as an isolated part, because it's unlikely that Joel was including Gentiles in this. It's very likely that Joel was this notion of pouring out the Spirit would have been solely on the people who believed in Yahweh. And so, but also it kind of heralds the start of that journey that we see come into fruition in Acts, and how so much of what we do as individuals, especially you and I both in the LGBTQI community, is that sense of these things being a journey that we often do start in the places where it seems like it's the select few that receive, but then how that very often is the start of the journey for people to go, actually, no, we're still people. And you do see some of that in here, because, there is, I will pour out the Spirit on all flesh, on your sons and daughters. So we do see a movement here, a kind of a movement from the patriarchal model into this Spirit being on your sons and your daughters. So it's almost like the start of an inclusive journey. And I was reflecting on how much kind of inclusion the issues surrounding Black Lives Matter and how we understand racial justice now to maybe how we understood it 10 years ago is so dramatically different. But the seeds and the transformation often is not an overnight thing, that this takes a long, long time. And a lot of people's hopes and dreams and disappointments and trauma and voices and silence all go into that journey.
Absolutely. And I think that's really interesting, because one of the things we've moved away from saying inclusive, we call ourselves Inclusive Gathering Birmingham, but we often try and push back and saying we are an inclusive gathering, because we're always trying to be more inclusive. I love the line of from one of the hymns, draw the circle wider, because you're always trying to make it more inclusive. And sometimes you just miss the point, or your context misses something that someone else has to voice to go, oh, wait a second, we've kind of been narrower than we thought we were. And I think it's really interesting to talk about that journey that, what Joel may have intended, and then what Peter intended, and then what Paul may have intended in his, is constantly going, actually, God's bigger than I've made God out to be. He's bigger than I've made the inclusion out to be. And I think that, I think there's something really interesting about that. And your use of the word journey, which is what is drawn out in the Timothy reading, is running the race and all of that kind of stuff, to the finish line. And I guess I was quite interested in Paul's kind of context in the Timothy, and whether it's Paul's hand or someone of later, in 2 Timothy. But I think that recognition of the phrase crown of righteousness being around martyrdom, but it almost seems that Paul is being persecuted for standing for what is right, and sometimes running that race and moving in the direction that is the right direction. Often others cannot understand, or it threatens others and the power. And he was in a place where he articulates there was nobody there to kind of represent me or talk or advocate for me, but I'm holding on to what I believe to be true. And I think that's the same for particularly those people that are ahead of what's going on, running ahead of the journey that everybody else is, that they're often in a place where people are wanting to push away because it's threatening. Actually they're doing something really important. And I think there's that word of encouragement, isn't it, that it's holding on to what to be right before God in that journey, however far ahead you are, however far you're pushing it, and not being allowed to be, because it's a tough place, tough place to be. We see it all the time. I hate to delve into the comments of social media, because it's one of the most heartbreaking places. You'll see a beautiful piece about justice, and your heart will sing and think, and then you'll read the comments and go, how are there so many people that even have those views that you think, I don't understand what your fear is, or why you hate that, or what does it matter if somebody is different to you or wants to express themselves differently. And I think there's a challenge to have to, as Christian people following where God may be setting the goal of the race, to stay on that path, when often the world is saying, actually, that's not how we want it, or that doesn't suit our purpose, And I think politically, sometimes the current climate is like the narrative of party politics, isn't it, is around what suits us and our own. And I think very much Conservative parties, is well recognised for meeting the needs of a certain sector of society that want things in a different way. And so there's often a creation of narrative, isn't there, that challenges what we would see as being the right way forward. So I'm moving into throwing a few different things into the pot here, but I guess there's that interesting challenge, isn't there, as Christian people and as preachers, about how much we challenge the systems and how much we respond to the need that's right in front of us. Because there are those two elements, aren't they, of the political standing up for the narrative, challenging, speaking out against policy, which is key. But then there's also that immediate need, and more now than ever in kind of cost of living crisis, and how do we as churches stop people sinking as well as change the system so that they don't fall in the river in the first place, like using that probably mixing metaphor here, but that kind of so I think there's it's a hard one of kind of how do you set yourself in that, coming back to Timothy, that race of doing what is right and recognizing what is ours to do. Sometimes where do you put your energy is a big challenge, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think as we see through the kind of the Joel reading, the races, they take different people in different communities along on journeys. And I think sometimes if we look kind of quickly into the reading of Luke, where we have the Pharisee and the tax collector, the Pharisee standing there, almost holier than thou. I pray twice. I do this. I do, almost that I'm above you over there because I am doing the right thing at the right time. And Jesus kind of challenges that notion of kind of us getting ahead of ourselves with this, that sometimes we do want to kind of race to put everything right that we see around us, or race to kind of to help everybody around us. And sometimes I think there's an acknowledgement in these readings that there are concurrent races going on, and there are people who are not listened to by other sections of we see this on social media, like you say, all of the time. And it's very hard, I think, and the temptation is that we widen our circle beyond our capabilities, beyond what we can actually do. And I think there's something, especially in the Luke narrative, and again in the Timothy, there is a bit about like, slow down. This is this is a race. There is a finishing line, but we might not be there yet. Paul's kind of alluding to, I am there. Everybody's left me. This is my time now, Timothy. And what I find interesting is how Paul talks about that crown of righteousness like it's his. But yet in the parable in Luke, we are told really strongly not to exalt ourselves, but it will be the humble that will be exalted and not the other way around. And it struck me that Paul's just perhaps done what the Pharisee was doing. I have run the good race. And sometimes in that we forget to slow down and be community, to take on that journey one step at a time. And sometimes, like we see in Joel, all right, probably Gentiles weren't in it, but women were. It's sometimes how we are patient with journeys. I think there's a lot of patience and hope to be brought out of these readings.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's really interesting, isn't it, that Paul is the one that bigs himself up the most. He's I wouldn't like to challenge his sense of ego, but I think there's a defensiveness to him, isn't it? Because there's that context of others challenging, is he really an apostle? So he's constantly trying to defend, yes, I am a man of God. This is why I love scripture, because it invites you into this this tension that you have to kind of converse with. It's not this is the simple answer. But I think for Luke, I was thinking about this. I was thinking of the ways in the church we kind of very easily sit on our own righteousness about the way we do. And I'm always conscious of sometimes the way people do it in a privileged, particularly middle class way, where that I buy fair trade, or I've got an electric car and all of that. And you kind of, which they're not bad things. It's good that you're doing those things, but not everybody has the ability to do those same things. And in some sense, it's privilege that enables you to spend more money or buy, you know, and for other people, when you're just trying to survive, which lots of people are doing, and particularly now, those things just, you can't grasp at, you can't, you know, you can't deal with. So our sense of righteousness in terms of being right with God has nothing to do with that. That's part of, you know, that's part of your contribution to living well. But actually, we have to be really careful that in our conversations in churches, we don't actually exclude people by making out a certain righteousness or a way of life. Really godly. And for me, that the thing that sticks out about the person who says, you know, I am a sinner is what I think is so important, and what I kind of alluded to in when I was asked to kind of describe myself, is the spirituality at the heart of justice, which is the closeness to God. And it's not, for me, it's often, well, it isn't about how do I do this grand mission of sorting life out, you know, saving the world. That's God's job. For me, the spirituality and being close to God and taking time to use whatever spiritual practices to kind of align closer to God that work for different people is around noticing God at work, that concept of missio Dei, and going, actually, what am I being invited to join in with? What am I being invited to do? The wisdom of what is mine to now do in this next week or this next day, or you know, is it mine to write a letter today, or is it mine to go out and feed somebody, you know, rather than trying to be a savior or a hero and do the big kind of, I'm going to set up a charity that's going to, what is it that I'm here to do as part of the kingdom of God? And I always think if every Christian just did that, well, that would be transformational in itself, wouldn't it? Because, you know, all of those kind of small great things, as Martin Luther King would say, you know, those small notions.
And so I think he calls that out by honouring the tax collector who is, you know, that beating one's chest, beating one's breast is absolute anguish. And there is a sense of, like, in that space, being exalted is not anywhere near that your mental kind of space, because actually, if you've got that much pain, and we actually see it in Joel as well, because, you know, the first chapter in Joel, they've had the locusts, they've had all this inflicted on them again. The lament of the chapter 1 in Joel versus the response by God to chapter 2. If that's where you're at, I doesn't come into your being, because there is that sense of the more you have, the more righteous you believe, you know, you come. And I think as well, there is that tension with the eco stuff, where people feel that kind of those people who are able to be ecological and can afford these things are the righteous of our day, but they're expensive, and to buy fair trade is often not a choice for people, because there is that expense that goes upon that. There is not righteousness in being able to do these things. I think what we lose when we start to do that is this sense of being in that space where all you can see is God, and that's where Paul very much is at the end of this. Everything's come down to him and God. The Lord is the one who's not deserted him. And I think seeing how our lives play out and who the righteous are often portrayed to be is really interesting now, versus possibly what you would have thought righteous to be 10 years ago.
Absolutely. And there's this real sense, I think, of this belief in righteousness and privilege, I think, are very close. And there's something interesting kind of to explore with that. But there's also the tax collector, and I think it's really ironic that the taxes, you know, at the moment are so messed up, and here we are talking about a tax collector, you know. But I mean, very different notion, you know. I mean, the tax collector in the time was taking the taxes for the Romans, but also filling their own pockets, you know. So there was that and kind of, but also trapped in the system that they're in. And there's that recognition from the tax collector that actually I'm not, you know, there's this feeling of I'm not happy with who I am, but I'm in this system, and this is, you know, my you know, people often say, oh, well, you shouldn't do that for work, you know, or you shouldn't. But if that's all you know and that's what you're dependent on, it's really difficult to break that system.
Yeah.
And often when we feel we're righteous, we forget the times that we are propping up unhealthy systems. You know, when we buy our clothes, how many of us know? Well, we don't. We have no idea the lifestyle of somebody who's made our clothes, or, you know, and when we're putting into systems that that exploit, even just being in a modern society which is fairly wealthy as a whole, you know, and you know, I'm not talking about the individuals. You know, there is an element of exploitation from history that has happened to get us to this point, to be what we would call an advanced economy. But also there's still exploitation. You know, the reason we can get things cheap is because we pay less in other places. And so there's, you know, and I individually can't do anything about that, but I have to, and I do constantly say, God, this hurts me because I know through some of it I know I'm sinning, and some of it I have no idea about. I'm trapped. I'm trapped in this system. You know, and I think that's the healthy attitude of the tax collector, is going, you know what, I'm in a situation where I just don't know what, you know, we don't know what his options were to kind of get out of it, but I know, you know, in my heart, this isn't right. Whereas it's so easy to go, oh, well, I bought a nice electric car and I buy fair trade and I do X, Y, and Z, to go, oh, I'll ignore all the other stuff. And for me, that's the you know, I think often in the parables, isn't it, it's two extremes. Most of us are a mix of the two, you know, we carry the both. So at times we're righteous and show that kind of, oh, look at me, I've done this, you know, and at other times I feel really worthless, you know, but, you know, there isn't that, you know, almost story, isn't it, where you have the two extremes. For most of us, it's
but that is the extreme, isn't it? And that's how we see such a divide, is that sense of righteousness on both sides of, you know, and I think particularly in American politics, you know, kind of the Republicans believing they are the righteous ones because they're preserving life and things like that in their words and in their mind. And yet you've got the other side, the Democrats, who believe that their kind of way is the righteous way. And actually, if we stopped all the righteous nonsense and just actually got on with understanding that if we can afford to buy clothes, that doesn't make us righteous. If we can't afford to buy clothes, that doesn't make us unrighteous. It really is that tension of being able to sit where you are, knowing, as Paul did, that even on your own, when you're in bed, the Lord is beside you. And there's such enormous hope and beauty, I think, that comes out of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's where it falls down to, isn't it? It's that right relationship with God. Where, you know, you that is your source, you know, that is the source. It's you know, for me, I'm very much into kind of spirituality and mystics, and I wouldn't claim to be anyone that's any good at it, but, you know, I take an interest in the sense that recognizing the true self is that self rooted in God, and there are things that you cannot control and there are things you can, and it's about allowing God to enable you to live the best life. And Paul is, in some sense, is saying, you know, that's what I've tried to do. I'm here now, I'm alone, but I've been with God through it, and I've done what I felt was mine to do. And that's all, in essence, I think that's all we're all asked to do, is to do what is ours to do in God. That's what the race comes down to. Absolutely.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for being on with us and sharing your wisdom and your reflections with us today. Thank you to everybody else for joining us to ask whether or how we should preach politics in our pulpit this week. If you enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts and share this episode among your friends. We love to have an ongoing conversation with our listeners about faith and politics. So do join us on Twitter at @pulpit_politics, or use the hashtag Politics in the Pulpit. or you can join us on our Facebook community, which you can access through the Joint Public Issues Team Facebook page and their website, jointpublicissues.org.uk. And so the question I'm leaving you with from this week's readings: where do you see yourself when you are alone with God? Do let us know your thoughts, or either on Twitter or on Facebook. And so let's go into both our politics and our pulpits with this blessing. May you be anointed with God's Spirit as you bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.